Einstein once said, if we knew what it was we were doing, it would not be called research, would it? At the beginning of this school year, during the open phase of AP research, I felt as if I were the most boring person on the planet, that I had no interest whatsoever, because I couldn't decide what I wanted to research. However, I think it ended up being the opposite. I have so many interests that I didn't feel I could commit to any one topic. This was reflected in the vast, numerous amounts of revisions I went through on my research inquiry process. However, I feel lucky to have gone through this process, as it strengthened the commitment to the research I'm going to talk to you guys about today. When reading a source titled Dissension in the Face of the Holocaust, the 1941 American Debate over Anti-Semitism, I began to make connections I never even really considered existed. I knew that there were citizens in the United States who were racist, and I knew that Jewish people had not always been welcomed with open arms, but I never considered these two ideas to be connected. I think this is primarily because it's something we don't really learn in history classes. When we learn about World War II, we learn about Nazis possessing anti-Semitic views and American reluctance to enter war efforts. We don't really consider Americans possessing this exact same racism. To me, this is mind-boggling, because there's so much research on World War II. This is why I felt so inclined to look into this largely undiscussed shortcoming in American history. For the purposes of this research, anti-Semitism was defined very simplistically, as racist feeling or sentiment towards those of Jewish descent. With that established, we are going to be looking into three main ideas. The first, American anti-Semitism and its alternate perspectives. The second, looking at alternate reasons for reluctance. And third, seeing if there's a connection between these two ideas. This led me to my research question: how did American anti-Semitism contribute to reluctance to enter World War II efforts? My initial assumption was that it contributed greatly. Let's see if I was right. In order to test my hypothesis, I needed to have a proper research method. I knew that I wanted to conduct qualitative research, as I was looking at assumptions, ideas, motivations, and opinions, instead of looking at quantitative number analysis. I also knew that the process I wanted to go through was reading a bunch of sources, finding recurring themes and arguments, and from there, constructing my own opinions and conclusions and discussion. This is very synonymous with the idea of historical research, which is why I felt like it was the perfect method for me to conduct my research under. After establishing my methodology, I knew that I needed lots of information. I needed information on anti-Semitism and reluctance. And in order to make sure that this was restricted and representative of the population at this time, I created a time frame that limited from 1936 to 1941. I chose this time frame because tensions began to peak around the mid-1930s, and America entered war in December of 1941. I also chose this time frame as this was when citizens were most vocal about not wanting to enter war, probably because they weren't actively involved in combat at this time. I relied heavily on the databases ProQuest, EBSCO, and JSTOR, and these were all chosen for a multitude of reasons. One of them was that I was allowed to restrict to peer-reviewed scholarly articles, which ensured the credibility and validity of my research. Excuse me. After I began finding sources, I knew that I was going to be looking for major themes, and the themes that I focused on were ideas that included proof for and against American anti-Semitism, isolationism and alternate reasons for American reluctance to join World War II, and possible connections between American anti-Semitism and reluctance. The first of these themes that we're going to talk about is American anti-Semitism. Originally, when I thought of American involvement in World War II, I pictured things like this, with American soldiers liberating concentration camps. And while this is a heroic, absolutely necessary part of history, it doesn't get the full picture. We need to look at alternate perspectives. The two that I'm going to be focusing on today, I think, are very interesting. The first is this idea that people believed Americans could not possess any racism against Jewish people. Instead, they considered that it was an ideology brought over by foreigners, because they really strongly didn't believe this was due to any American foster hostilities. However, this doesn't make much sense, as when you look at American-based hate groups like the KKK, who were, who discriminated against those of Jewish descent. And also when we see that 3/5 of Americans believe Jews had undesirable traits. It doesn't make much sense. It doesn't prove to be true. When we look at political cartoons like these, Jews are the cause of high taxes, slavery, starvation, and death. This doesn't seem to be wreaking acceptance, does it? To me, it seemed more that citizens were having a hard time accepting that there was racism in the United States, which was reflected in the reluctance to enter war efforts. The second thing that we're going to be looking at is all about reluctance. and the transition from isolationism to neutrality and favoring an Allied victory, while also considering economic and political scares that kept citizens' apprehensions high before entering war. The first that we're looking at is isolationism, and this is the idea that citizens wanted to stay separate or isolated from foreign affairs. After World War I, many citizens identified with this. They felt like they didn't win anything, so they didn't want to become entangled in foreign affairs. This even increased more whenever European nations began fighting. However, this ideology could not exist for long. It began to transition into neutrality. And the idea of neutrality is that Americans would trade with both sides, but they would not have a favorite. This, too, didn't last for long. I think this quote does a great job explaining the next shift that happened. It is practically impossible to believe that any free nation anywhere will remain neutral in its hearts, making it foreseeable when the United States began to favor an Allied victory. While the United States wanted England and France to win, they still wanted to stay out of war. Another contributing factor was concern for the state of the economy. After the Great Depression, there was large concern about the uncertainty of where the economy would end up at. While some suggest that vamping up war supplies and returning to a wartime economy was beneficial for the overall state of the economy, it's also been proven that increasing war supplies and revamping ammunition has historically contributed to war. So while citizens were concerned for the state of the economy and worried about how a global war would impact that, they were still very reluctant to enter. The last I'm going to tell you about is what I find the most interesting: the idea that Americans believed World War II was not their fight or their concern. One group that does a great job exemplifying this is America First. They believed that when they were told their borders lie in Europe and that anything Nazi Germany did was against American beliefs, they didn't believe it. They were more concerned that citizens were losing a say in foreign affairs. An attempt to combat this was the Ludlow Amendment, and this proposed that the United States would have a national vote before Congress could declare and enter war, except for in the case of an attack on American soil. While this was not passed, many citizens agreed with this and found that they identified with it and wanted it to happen. One member, Charles Lindbergh, who was a prominent member of America First, perfectly illustrates concerns, declaring if freedom means anything at all, it means that free citizens have the right to decide whether or not they send their men to die in foreign wars. To summarize, we examined three main ideas: American anti-Semitism, proving its existence in the United States, and we also explored multiple reasons for citizens' apprehension to enter war efforts. Now we begin to consider if these ideas are connected. This research I've spent the past 6 months conducting provided me with the results that anti-Semitism in America was another factor that played a role in the apprehension to enter war against the Axis powers, but the extent to which is unknown. This research is not claiming that it was the most likely factor citizens were reluctant, but instead that it played a role. So now we need to discuss the validity of my results. The things that we know, things we've proved already. Americans possessed anti-Jewish ideologies, and Americans wanted to stay out of war. This just re-established my question: what all contributed? And you're probably thinking, you just told us, lots of things contributed, but anti-Semitism contributed as well. It contributed to not taking the oppression of Jewish people seriously, mirroring the reluctance to enter World War II. Here's a roadmap for the way that I will be proving my results' validity. We're going to be talking about four main ideas. The first is looking at Hitler's very clear, open plans and how they were ignored, looking at the immigration epidemic that took place where Jewish people were fleeing Germany, the United States' reluctance to take that seriously as well, and then also looking back more at Hitler's open and clear ideology and how it too was ignored. The first that we're going to look at are a couple of laws that were set in place. The first are the Nuremberg laws, which restricted Jewish people from partaking in public business. It took away the Jewish right to vote, and it also, it also took away license for professions like doctors and professors that were Jewish. And the second of these is the protection of German blood and honor, and this was the idea that Jewish people and non-Jewish people could not get married, and it also created separate institutions and facilities for those who are Jewish and those who are not. While Hitler's ideas and beliefs were very open, he was very open about his plans, his threats and statements were not taken seriously in Germany or outside of Germany. And this either means that they didn't think he was being serious or it wasn't concerning enough. And both of these are very concerning beliefs. We knew that racism and Jewish people's lives were being impacted day to day, yet nothing was done. No one declared war. The United States did not declare war. The second of these reflects from these restrictions that were set in place, and Jews began fleeing Germany. A mass epidemic of immigration took place, where Jews began fleeing Germany. The United States and 22 other countries got together at the Evian Conference to discuss this immigration issue. And the thing is, the United States called together this conference, so it cannot be argued that the United States didn't know what was going on. Instead, they showed so little interest of helping that it's as if they didn't care for the sake of Jewish safety. This is reflected when you see the citizens' response to Jewish people trying to enter the United States. When we look, 72% of Americans were opposed to Jewish immigration. We have ships like St. Louis, which held refugees, predominantly Jewish, that was turned away. And we also have to consider that the United States State Department made it extremely difficult for refugees to apply for entry visas. All of these contributed to American reluctance to let Jews into the United States. And as previously mentioned, they didn't find Jewish people and their traits desirable. If they didn't find them desirable and weren't willing to help them at home, they wouldn't be willing to help them abroad, enhancing and contributing to reluctance. The last of these, to me, is the most striking, and it's the idea that Hitler claimed he went to war for the idea of Lebensraum, which is creating room for Germans, and in order to do so, they had to get rid of Jewish people. This idea was first introduced by Rudolf Hess, but while Hitler was very open about this, and it was clear that he had a plan to get rid of Jews, we cannot assume that the United States knew the extent to which this would increase, but they knew of the vast amount of legislation and laws that were restricting daily people's lives. They knew about Jewish immigration and the extent to which it was occurring, and they also knew about Hitler and the Nazi Party's anti-Semitic beliefs. With all of this information known, it's too strong of a coincidence that the United States was reluctant to enter war, had citizens who were anti-Semitic, and also were unwilling to help Jewish people fleeing Germany. With all of these, it is clear that the United States was reluctant to help based on anti-Semitism. While conducting my research and analyzing sources, I was under the impression that anti-Semitism was a major factor that contributed to reluctance. In the end, however, I realized that this factor maybe not necessarily contributed as greatly as I thought, the extent to which I don't know. But instead, this research is claiming that it too contributed. For future research, I acknowledge that I was unable to quantify each of these factors, and what I think would be very impactful would be if there was a way to identify and attribute numbers to each factor so that we would be able to compare the factors and see which one did in fact contribute the most. And the way that I see it, any new information collected can help further the understanding of how tragedies like World War II happen and can prevent from these same mistakes being made again in the future. So significance, why you guys should care, why I care, why we all should care. This isn't something that's discussed in history classes. It isn't a part of World War II conversation. The things that we already know and discuss. The United States did not enter World War II until after Pearl Harbor was attacked. Citizens were reluctant to enter war because of that. Nazis possess anti-Semitic views, and that the United States did in fact help end World War II. What we don't know, what we need to discuss, is that there were citizens in the United States who were anti-Semitic. And even though the United States helped bring an end to World War II, they were not always the heroes. Honesty and maturity is needed to reflect on the hard parts of history. People are people, and they deserve honesty. The entire story of World War II needs to be present in order to get a full grasp of the detrimental effects of racism. Keeping conversation open and being forthright is an attempt to keep history from repeating itself. We cannot have 45 million people dying. That's unacceptable. We get a lot of people dying because of the color of their skin, their personal choices, or the religion they identify with. That is what makes people people. The variety life has to offer should never be taken for granted. Thank you. And here are the sources that I used throughout this entire presentation. They're very reliable, I can assure you. And last, I would like to send a formal thanks to the panelists for watching my presentation. I hope that you enjoyed it and found it interesting and learned something new. I know I sure have. And I would also like to thank my classmates and my teacher for making me a more thoughtful and reflective student. And I take great pride in being part of the AP Research Pilot Program. Thank you.
Thank you, Cameron. I'm going to go ahead and start off with our oral defense questions. So I will ask you the first question. What was the most important source of information you found while conducting your research, and why was it so important?
As I mentioned in the beginning of my presentation, the source to me that stood out the most was a very long, lengthy source title. It was The Dissension in the Face of the Holocaust, the 1941 American Debate over Anti-Semitism. And that is the source that introduced me to the idea that citizens in the United States were anti-Semitic. And like I mentioned, I knew that there was racism in the United States and that Jewish people have historically not been welcomed very greatly. And so it was just this idea that these could be connected and that it is something that we really don't talk about in history, but it is such an important part of history. And so that source, reflecting on that and reading that, it just opened up a new world to me that I didn't even consider existed, that I felt very strongly needed to be addressed.
Thank you.
Cameron, thank you. What additional questions emerged during your research? And then I have a second part to that. And then based on your recent experience, what advice would you give to other researchers who might choose to investigate those questions?
One of the questions that I had after my part of this research, and even during, was wondering how the presidential administration, like Congress and things like that, what their opinions were on this, because I focused more on citizens' opinions. And while Congress and the president are supposed to reflect citizens' opinions, I wondered if it was different. And since they have more of a say in what happens, and like declaring war and things like that, if there were any people in Congress that were blatantly anti-Semitic or Nazi supporters or anything like that. And I think the best way to go about doing that, and if anyone was to be looking into that side of the research, what I would suggest would be to look strictly at like congressional records, and then like voting, I can't think what the word, but like the voting of members of Congress and things like that, and just their personal stories, and seeing if any, because obviously you aren't going to find anyone who's outright saying, I'm anti-Semitic, but being able to reflect and take a step back and see if it was a factor in Congress as well as just the people.
Right. Great job.
Thank you.
Okay, so what unanticipated turn did you encounter as your research progressed? And what were the reasons for this change in direction or focus, and how did you modify your methods or approach?
That is the perfect question for me, and something that I really wanted to focus on in my presentation, but due to time restraints didn't have. At the beginning of this year, I was really interested in something totally unrelated to what I ended up researching, and it was the idea of resiliency. And I thought that it was very interesting that certain people had the capacity of survival and thriving, while other people didn't. And I wanted to know why that was. And so then that evolved into looking into where I could take that in future research. And it was focused primarily on teaching resiliency to students in an academic setting. And while it's extremely important, it was just not what I was interested in. So then I began to take a more morbid approach on resiliency and looking into the human capacity for evil, and how even though throughout all cultures there's evidence of evil or bad things happening and people doing things that aren't necessarily the best. And so that to me was what made me really interested in World War II, because I thought it was a perfect example for that. And when I looked into it, I was having a hard time knowing what direction I wanted to take, and then reading the source that I was telling Ms. McGuffey about, I realized that there was an entire side that I hadn't even noticed. And in order to do that, my methodology changed, because I was focusing more on a historical event, and so then I had to focus more on historical research and less anthropological base, which would be hermeneutic, which is a crazy idea for a research method where you focus on a specific group of people and their story, and you have to kind of live in that environment, and so it was just impossible for me to do that. But I'm very glad that the direction that I went in ended up being what I showed you guys today, because I feel very passionately about that.
Are there any follow-up questions? I do have one, Cameron. Do you see any connections between your research and contemporary global affairs? And if you do, what are those connections and why are they important?
I very, very strongly see connections that are existing right now. Towards the end of my presentation, when I made the statement of people should not be dying because of the color of their skin or their personal choices or the religion they identify with, because people are people and the variety life has to offer is so fantastic. We see very similar situations happening with Syrians fleeing Syria, and it's the exact same idea with the epidemic of immigration and where are they going to go, and people not necessarily being willing to help out or closing their borders, things like that. So I do see very strong connections, and it's very concerning to me as we see what ended up happening with this. I obviously can't make the assumption that the exact same thing would happen, but it is taking a very similar path at the beginning, and I think that more people need to be open to reflecting on past events and seeing how we can learn from it even today with issues like the Syrian refugee crisis.
Okay, thank you, Cameron. All right, let me turn it